You can start.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to our um, uh, webinar on cutting edge work in the field of international relations and the Muslim world. Today we are really lucky to have two um, very brilliant, esteemed colleagues and friends, uh, both Asim Qureshi and um, and Walaa Quisay, who are both here joining us. We're so pleased to have Asim come and be at the center with us, and Walaa is joining us online. They will be discussing their newly published book, Only God Can See, on political prisoners and their experiences. Uh, and we're going to take a deep dive together, and I wanted to keep this format a little bit more fluid so that we could really get into the weeds. Um, but first, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. First, I will start with Dr. Walaa Quisay, who is a professor and researcher at University of Edinburgh. She's a scholar of religious studies. She had just before this published a really brilliant book on neo-traditionalism. And I remember when she was here in Istanbul, and we had a lot of very interesting conversations. She worked at Shahir University here, and then University of Manchester, and she's been a very uh, great interlocutor for all of us in the field. Um, her She co-authored this recent book, the one that we're going to discuss, When Only God Can See. So welcome, Dr. Quisay. Um, Really a pleasure to have you. Um, Dr. Asim Qureshi, he's a old friend of ours. He's also an associate and honorary faculty member here at SIGA. He specializes in international law and Islamic law. He completed his PhD in international conflict analysis. He is the research director at Cage, and he's also well published, just like our co-author here. He's published a number of books, specializing especially on Islamophobia um, and uh, and resistance. One of his books, first book was titled "Rules of the Game." The second one is "What is Islamophobia?" and "A Virtue of Disobedience." And now we have this brilliant addition um, to his publications. And he was also one of the editors of our SIGA publication, The Terror Trap. So welcome to both of you. Um, you know, I was really pleased to read the book, and I want to congratulate both of you first of all. And I'm honored that you guys are presenting the book here at SIGA. Um, and first, I'd like to open by saying, just giving us a brief background, right, on how this idea emerged and how you both came to focus on this topic. Uh, so if you could just both, very briefly talk about the journey to the book, um, that would give us a little bit of background. Yeah. So um, I'll give it uh, I'll give it to Asim first.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. Um, so I did a podcast with Mazen Beg, the former Guantanamo Bay outreach director of our organization Cage, based in the UK. And I remember speaking to him on the phone one day before the podcast and saying, there is in all the stories that I've been hearing you tell over the years, there is a specific fiqh, jurisprudence that comes about out of the kind of unique scenarios that you were in. Mazen tells this amazing story of being on his very first rendition flight from Pakistan to Afghanistan, I think it was, or maybe it was from Afghanistan to the US. And, he was completely in a state of like bewilderment. He didn't know what was going on, what was going to happen in his life. And blindfolded, hooded, strapped to the floor of a plane, somebody taps on his shoulder and says, "Have you prayed?" And he's like, "What is going on?" Like, and I'm being asked whether or not I pray, and I'm in this situation where that's everything. Yeah, and God sees them talking and threatens to take Moses' life. In that moment, something comes over him. He, says to the brother, "Well, you're in that position, man. So you lead the salah." They prayed in Jaman in this unique situation. And I was always struck by that story and many other stories that I've heard Mars tell over the years. So I said to him, let's do an event together where I get to ask you questions about kind of the unique situations. But we did that event, so I've been thinking about myself. Just so happens that but if we have to Walaa?
Yeah, sorry. I heard half of that, so just try. I heard half of that, sorry. So make sure that you're close to the mic. Uh, can you
Can you hear him now, Walaa?
I can hear you. I
What
can't
I mean
hear
now.
him. Yeah, now I can. Just yeah, sorry about that.
Stop moving. No,
Now I can hear you. Okay, I think this
you're
mic
hearing the mic now.
I think the mic is a bit
I think it's
faulty or weird. Um,
Oh, you
so
can use OS mic.
Yeah, you can use mine.
yeah, that one seems to work. I'm sorry about that. Uh,
that was the Oasis thing, by the way. Just so we're clear. Sorry, going under the bus, bro. Yeah, that's what bros do to each other. I mean, I don't think I need to repeat all of that, but yeah, I'll just say that alhamdulillah, when I was working right, I was interested in the subject for a while, determining about various aspects of their Islamic life in prison, whether it was dream, Bahara, Salah, and we're just talking one together quite interesting.
my
Yeah,
turn.
yes. Walaa, your turn.
Yeah.
We'll get this right very soon.
It's gonna work. So I think we came at this separately and then together. I think there was a moment where it was light bulb. We can do something about this together, and there seems to be a lot of interesting sort of overlaps. Initially, when I was at Manchester, I was working on hunger strikes, and I was looking particularly. I was investigating debates about the permissibility of hunger strikes and the conditions and the sort of hermeneutics around why some people deem hunger strikes, particularly in the prison context, permissible, and why others deem it impermissible, and how prisoners think about this question in their own spaces. And I knew this was going to be the case. I didn't know to the extent. I knew that there was a particular way, like religious practices are formed within the prison context, but the dynamics of it had kind of eluded me. So one big thing that came up is the role of prison chaplains, or the religious discourse of the prison authorities. And it seemed that there was an almost contestation by the prison authorities and the prisoners in producing religious knowledge. But also, there seemed to be a particular like religious culture that develops from different prison contexts. Within the Egyptian context, there are a wide variety of prison conditions, but there were a few things that were not just interesting from a quote unquote research perspective, but it was a very, very human thing. And I think one of the things that touched me the most was hearing the story of how prisoners in solitary confinement try to find ways to pray together. And it really struck me because I heard the same stories in the Guantanamo Bay context, but in also the Egyptian context and in the Emirati context, where people try to line up through the power of sound, line up in particular ways in order to maintain like congregation together. And of course, there were debates about whether it would be permissible to, like, at least in the Egyptian context, to pray when you can't see the imam. But that added just to the pluralism of it all. And I think so the fiqhi dimension was very, very interesting because even beyond the issue of rituals, it leads you to think about how prisoners conceptualize their own incarceration. So one thing I found in the Egyptian context is the notion of captivity, or asr, being a very significant way in which prisoners organize their religious lives. And from that, they derive rulings on shortening and combining prayers, on many things. And then it kind of pushes you into places where if you are in a place of enforced disappearance and you don't know how long you are you considered a traveler? Are you considered a muqim? And those are really, really interesting questions. But beyond that, it really is interesting how prisoners conceptualize their own incarceration. And beyond all of that, the absolute sheer power of faith stories, of the stories of Iman that that come together in so many different ways, like the stories of the Quran, the question of suffering. Like one thing that came, like one story that came and through my interviews was the question of free will. If I have free will, then how come I'm in a place where I can't enact that free will? And so the very notion of free will becomes under question. So I was sort of talking to Asim about my interviews, and I think that there was a moment of like, yeah, maybe we should do this. And he brought it up. And initially it was supposed to be a fiqh manual, right? Where we were supposed to talk about like just outline the different ways people actually do ritual practices in prison. But then we realized the story needs to be fuller. And so, yeah, the structure and the way how we wrote the book was something that was constantly changing. And yeah, and we tried as much as we can to make it as accessible as possible, but also to highlight the stories I mean, everything is mediated, of course, but as much as possible, have the voices of the prisoners narrate the narrative, like push the narrative, and not have our own sort of like biases inform it. And like no one can claim that this is something like we are narrators in one way or another. So this isn't like a process of 100%. There's always an element of like moving the narrative, but we really, really wanted to showcase the prisoners' own stories and how they talked about it in their own voices.
Thank you. So let me jump into the text. I'm not going to let you guys get away with this. We didn't craft anything and we didn't touch anything. I'm gonna ask you some good questions about the editorial and the decisions you guys made. But
Okay.
let me talk about how I.
Can you bring the mic closer to you, sir?
The everything came together for me at the conclusion. You know, the conclusion was really impactful. I really began to see how the stories of these prisoners, you know, their stories and their struggles and their suffering, how every one of us should be attuned to that, because in a certain kind of metaphorical, or maybe even less than metaphorical way, we are all, especially those of us who are living in um, Muslim countries, which are under um, military rule or under authoritarian rule, how the prison is a kind of microcosm for a greater prison.
Yeah.
And that to me was very powerful, right? And especially the way that you guys used the text of Basma Abdulaziz as a way of kind of literary a literary tool to describe the experience between what the prisoners are feeling. So no longer was the text like this remote account of what's happening somewhere else, right? And then all of a sudden, I found myself as the reader reflecting on, wow, you know, there's so many ways in which, you know, their experiences, even though it seems so exceptional, right? There's parallels to what everyday citizens are going through, even though maybe we may not be as conscious and aware as the prisoners are of their own sufferings. So that conclusion was a really powerful thing. Now, I wanted to ask you guys about the the for lack of better terms, the political theology involved in the last chapter. So in the last chapter, you know, you described the state, this panopticon state, right? What you call the security state, as playing God on earth. And in some ways, the prison tries to maximize its control over the prisoners. And in doing so, it mimics God. So I guess I just want to know more about how Basma's text, or you know, the Q, which I haven't read, but now I will read because of your chapter. How that idea, you guys arrived at that idea, that at the end of the day, what we have here is this prison, whether it be society or the prison, in which there's someone trying to imitate God, right? And then we have basically the beginning of the book. So I went back and saw the epigraph at the beginning of the thing. Right?
I can't hear you again. I'm sorry.
It's a it's a verse from the Quran. Inna Allah, it's in lam ya'lam inna Allah yara. Alam ya'lam inna Allah yara, which is basically you saying, what I interpreted you saying is that, yeah, but there's always Allah who is actually the one who is in control. And so
Well, I can hear me okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Just speak up if you can't, okay, Charlie.
Okay.
So that I can come closer. Oh, wow. Okay. So that's not very kind of you. Therefore, to start with the conclusion. And especially after what I so eloquently explained why we were kind of sending the voices of the prisoners themselves. We wanted to try something different. Mostly to what we did, and we felt like the experiences of brothers spoke about. And so we wanted to.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Is that
Yeah.
better? We wanted to see what was done at level. And I had, both Walaa and I were familiar with basmati disease. But for those of you who don't know, basmati disease is a psychiatrist in Egypt who wrote a novel, it's actually written a couple of novels. It's effectively a dystopian novel written in the Arabic language that translated into English as well about it effectively tells the story of what was going to happen at Rabah before Rabah. Massacre. That's how close it is to what happened at Rabah. This was a year before Rabah took place. It's unbelievable. And she describes so many things like solitary confinement and the bureaucracy that goes on with prisons and just everything that people go through. But one of the key aspects of this novel is the way in which it shows how a state, an autocratic state, which is a mukhabarat state, it's a national security state, it becomes almost like a deified being, becomes like a godlike being because it determines everything that is good and bad in the world. So it determines what are the boundaries of acceptable behavior. And we found that was the case in both Egypt and the US. The US were constantly trying to dictate to prisoners, this is how you should believe. When they went on hunger strike, they sent in chaplains to say, this is haram, because you're not permitted to kill yourself. In Egypt, they did exactly the same thing, right? So the state, it constantly tries to define the parameters of what is acceptable. You know, one of my favorite moments in the whole book is in the resistance chapter when former Bagram prisoner, Abdul Basit, he describes, I asked him a question about his resistance techniques. He said, I wasn't like all of these other guys who like to do hunger strikes because why am I going to hurt myself for no reason? Because me personally, I preferred and pardon me, everybody, to effectively use my own feces in order to strike at the prison guards. This is while he was detained in Afghanistan. Because, why am I going to hurt myself? Let me hurt them. So, I became kamyab, which in Urdu, it's described as like skillful. Like I became kamyab in this thing. So like, you talked about having expert marksmen who were able to throw their feces right in the mouths of these prison guards. And I asked him, I said, didn't you feel like as Muslims, we put Tahara at the center of everything, almost everything starts and, begins with the action of ablution, of being clean. And even after actions, we try to clean ourselves as well. So, didn't you feel dirty about this? And they always come back to the same thing of Allah's mercy and understanding their situation. Of the phrase in the Quran, right? Like be conscious of God as much as you're able. He said in that moment we understand that our resistance will inevitably be okay with Allah. But because what we're doing is we're fighting against oppressive structure. And so the prison system wants to be rigid about its rules. It wants to own the Sharia and say, this is not permitted, this is not permitted. So whether it's the Americans or the Egyptians, they want to control what the Sharia is, but the prisoners are far too smart for that. And the book is throughout, it flows, you see it flows, that they own the religion themselves. We're not going to let you define our religion. We're going to show how this is a religion, one that is able to be expressed beyond your own restrictions. And we saw this, the US do this many times. I mean, even with the assassination of Osama bin Laden, when they dropped his body into the sea, they said that we've done this in compliance with Islamic law because we don't want to turn his body into a shrine. Regardless of the fact that he comes from an Islamic tradition that doesn't believe in shrines in the first place, right? But it's just this whole idea, this aspect that they are the ones who are in control, that they are the ones who control what true Islam actually is. And what the prisoners show is that any attempt at controlling what Islam is will be met with resistance, whether it's through making tayammum, whether it's through praying inside your heart or with your eyes, right? But now and so I think that's how we try to for the last more to say about the conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for these points. I think you hit I think the phrases hit the nail on the head. I think there are two things that in my head are very essential from what you said: the boundaries of the carceral and non-carceral, and the deification of the state, and in turn the prison. So one of the very first striking moments for me, and it's something that I've always knew to be true, but at some point it hit me. The majority of Muslim thinking that happened in the modern period, primarily in post-colonial Muslim settings, was filtered through prisons. Our ideas are filtered through prisons. Every intellectual has had some encounter with incarceration. Yet we tend to see incarceration as this, it's interesting, as this gloomy other, when in fact it's something that really does exist around us. The boundaries are there. There's an element of invisibility, but it's invisibility, it's willful invisibility. Like the air that you breathe is endowed with this knowledge that the carceral is all around you. When I was younger, this is something that I like is super, super, super vivid in my mind. I think I was around 11 years old. We were going to the dentist, my father, one of my father's friends and me. And this man looked so disheveled, and he was screaming in the street in the middle of the traffic, "There's no torture here. Mubarak is great. There's no torture in this country." And I think as a young person at the time, I was looking at everyone for acknowledgement that this person exists and what they're hearing, like that I'm hearing what they're hearing. But everyone ignored him. Everyone pretended that this wasn't happening. And when I went to Egypt after the revolution, it was the same eerie, like spatial sort of difference, where like a massacre would be happening under the bridge and we'd be driving and everything was normal. And it's the same eerie feeling that Abdullah Shami describes in the book, leaving Rabaa and then seeing the cafes opened. But the thing is, if people were to acknowledge that this was true, then they would be compelled to do something about it, or compelled to sort of acknowledge it. But the knowledge that at any single point, you too can be a victim, and also that this is so, so random that no one's really safe. But also the fact that really our intellectual heritage is marked by incarceration, but we haven't disentangled the way it was. I think one of the moments that really, really struck me when I was reading through Jawdat Saeed's work, and he's a very well-known Syrian nonviolent thinker. And I asked, so how many times was Jawdat Saeed imprisoned? And then the answer was 7 times. He'd been in and out of Syrian prisons 7 times, yet no one thought, or it was just not something that you would do to think about how sort of incarceration impacts the way this person views the world, or how the dynamics of like intellectual making within the prison context, because you have people from different backgrounds. So the boundaries of the carceral and the non-carceral are extremely, extremely fluid. And we were in a talk with Osama a few weeks ago, and he juxtaposed 2 things: what's happening now in Gaza, where we can all see, versus the Uyghur genocide, where we can't see. And in my head, it kind of did kind of like exemplify what's happening within how we perceive prisons, right? It's something that exists and it's all around us. Yeah, there's certain atrocities that you can see and certain atrocities that you know exist, and you know that they're atrocities, but they're invisible to the eye. But both are in the realm of reality. How do you relegate and navigate that to be how do you navigate it as a Muslim, as someone who these are your co-religionists? So the boundaries of the carceral and non-carceral are extremely, extremely, extremely fluid. But the fact that they are invisible, there's something within our psyche as sort of people living their normal lives, the kind of, we need to not see it. We need that invisibility to maintain how to maintain our lives, our everyday lives. So that part is really, really interesting. And so like the other aspect of it, the state or the prison authorities becoming a form of deity. There are actually like really, really violent ways in which the state tries to mark people as a non-entity belonging to them. I think in Guantanamo, they shaved crosses in their heads as a way to mark them, right? But it's interesting because even though the state or the prison authorities felt that they have humiliated and shamed these people, the prisoners knew that they weren't marked, that not a cross is going to, put you in that particular position. And the role of dreams, particularly for me, it exemplifies the really interesting kind of spiritual way that control is very, very fickle. I think it was Muhammad Sultan who mentioned this when he was talking about his dreams. And he said something akin to, dreams are a divine function of prisons, and you go to sleep and you see people you haven't met before. You're free. You're living your life, and you realize you are a human being that that is not necessarily someone who belongs to the state. Your body is free, your mind is free. You can communicate to God, and God communicates things to you that He wants you to know. And then you wake up and you know that you're in prison. But for a moment, you realize, well, there's something that's bigger out there. And I think that's one of the reasons spirituality and actually the insistence on proper ritual practices are so important, because on the one hand, this is just what Muslims do. On the one hand, Muslims are always going to try to find the correct qibla. They're going to do that in prison. They're going to do that outside of prison. They're going to do it in the library, in a mall, whatever. But on the other hand, it kind of like tells the prison authorities, yeah, you can try to like bar us from seeing the sun, but we're gonna try our best to realize that there's an authority beyond you. There's something that dictates ourselves, our bodies, our souls, that wants good for us, and that's who we're gonna obey, and that's not necessarily your rules. So there's something very, very powerful in the actual practices and the spiritual experiences in prison.
Thank you so much. I wanted to keep on that theme because another beautiful aspect of the book, right, is the ways in which the book shows how Islam and faith and deen is is a is a mode of empowerment for prisoners, and by analogy, we are all trapped in prison. Then the religion also becomes a mode of of hope and empowerment for us as well. And I want to get later on into the details about these kind of micro questions about ritual purity and prayer. But just staying at the landscape for a little bit, landscape view. I was really intrigued by, well, if our dream is a way of existence for the prisoners and us, right? And if our dream is a mode of resistance, what is the religion of the state? Right? Like, what is their religion? What is the state in the prison and in trying to be uh, in full control? What is their religion?
Religion
I
of the
would like
state
to.
itself, right? It's itself. That's even if it uses Islam, even if it uses other theologies, the religion of the state is maintaining itself. But I think always the interesting factor are the people that are just doing their jobs. And they carry a very peculiar place within the prison context for prisoners. Like they're a source of pity, but a sort of source of like anger as well. Like, why are you there? Why are you doing what you're doing? And it really always pushes like the story of Ibn Hanbal when he was asked, am I am I an aid to the oppressors? And Hanbal said, no, you are the oppressor. The aides are those that cook for them and clean for them. I think if I'm correct, remembering this correctly, but you actually do this. Yeah, so, and one of the things, again, back to the deification of the state and how the state sort of manages religions. In one instance, I saw or I heard that, and this is something that isn't common, where there was an actual prayer room and someone in the Egyptian context coming from the outside from the Ministry of Religious Affairs there to lead the prisoners in prayer, and he couldn't recite Fatha correctly. And it was a way that the prison authorities were trying to kind of categorize prisoners. So if you don't pray behind him, are you doing takfir? So do you belong to this group? Are you da-da-da? And one of the ways that they would try to control prisoners, and this is, it goes like to show you how very deeply ingrained this whole like control of religious practices is. There'd be one prisoner, one police officer, or one guard, one prisoner, one. So the prisoner is basically like entrapped between two officers who are praying beside him and listening to his prayers as well, and trying to dictate it in one way or another. And I remember Abdullah Shami was saying, I could hear every dua this man was making, and he can hear every dua I was making. And so every time he'd make a dua for himself, I would make the opposite dua. So the guard would say, may God bless my home, bless my children. And then Abdullah would respond, may God destroy his home and his children. And it would be a weird matter of like a battle even within the context of prayer. But like that image of like having an imam that's not qualified in order to compel people to show allegiance to the correct Islam by praying behind him. Or if you don't, then you belong to something else, and then there are harsher sort of laws or rules that will be put in place against you, but also having people right there praying, but also acting as guards to sort of hear and listen to how you pray and what du'as you make.
Yeah, there's so much to say about this, especially in terms of the state and the way it views itself. There's an interview that Walaa does, where the guard, where the interrogator says, I can't remember who it was, but he can tell me. It says, in prison, we are like God. We say kun fayakun, right? Like, I will learn. Like, nobody in this room would ever have the audacity to say something like that. But it shows something about the mentality that exists within the prison. the audacity to believe that you are a controller of life. And Walaa and I talked a lot about, kind of the arguments of Nimrod, saying that, I give life and I'm the one who gives death. And even the ayah in Surah Naziyat, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes Fir'aun as saying, Anna rabbukum al-a'la, I am your Lord most high. So there is a consistent strand that runs through this type of despotism, which is why we called it the deified national security state. That these despotic national security regimes, which are run by, mukhabarat, they're run by the national security state, they have to control every single aspect of life. Talal Asad, he writes actually that that the nation state, that doesn't believe in God, that doesn't believe its people believe in God, has to militarize itself against its own population, because it has to be the ultimate arbiter of all that is good and all that is wrong. It has to decide. It cannot rely on the everyday person to do it, which is why it requires mass surveillance, which is why it requires to intrude into our daily lives, but not only just into our lives, into our thoughts, into our behaviors, and it tries to restrict them. And what the prisoners do is that they upend that. At all times and all places, they find ways of showing that there is this one place that you cannot control, which is ultimately the qalb, right? It's the heart. It is the one place that they cannot physically enter and change, and it's a remarkable thing. Now, we have to caveat all this and say that the interviews that Walaa and I conducted were predominantly with practicing Muslims, okay? And that does skew the narrative in the book somewhat. There are people who suffered extreme crises of faith and didn't return to religion. And we have to acknowledge that. And maybe, maybe they will be ghair muqallaf in front of Allah. Maybe they will not be held accountable for the extreme torture they went through. We don't know, and we don't make that judgment on them, because some of the torture was very, very, very severe. In fact, some of the brothers who are here, who are in Guantanamo, will be able to tell you that when David Hicks renounced his faith inside prison, many of the brothers said, leave him be, because we don't know the state of his mind. Like, don't just start assuming that, bad thoughts about him, because, they've all gone through extreme torture. So, I think we have to just be a bit careful about taking too much meaning from the book in terms of, saying that this is a hujjah for the piety of Muslim prisoners. Yes, we see that a lot. We see that in the narratives. We see the dreams that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends them, like story after story. And we could have written an entire book just on the dreams of Muslim prisoners, and they are so amazing, so many of them, like dreams that consistently came true, sometimes not at the speed that they might like. Sometimes the brothers would dream of something that was going to happen in 3, and it would be interpreted as 3 days, and it would happen to be 3 years later that freedom would come, or that relief would come. So, the dreams were sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a form of relief, but it was always at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's time. And yeah, I guess there's just so much more to say, but I want to hear more questions.
If I can just add like a few more things, I think what it also tells us so I think within our heads, there's always this inherent secularization narrative or revival of religion narrative. And I think some people might be compelled to read this as like a kind of resilience and revival of faith narrative. But often what you find is that the stories of faith and non-faith are very much circular in nature. They're very much volatile, and they're very dependent. So people might change like so many different times within 1 month. And this isn't even just like in the case of like, what we perceive to be practicing Muslims. I think the stories of Iman and faith really like superimpose themselves on people's lives, whether you think you're a religious person or not. It's not even about your personal iman, it's about the power of God. And so people have to contend with these questions, but also have to contend with the mass amount of suffering. I think I was talking to a good friend, Basit Iqbal, about the stories of people, like the resilient stories of like former prisoners in Syria, and how like the stories of Iman are so vivid and so strong within the context of incarceration. But once people leave prisons, it feels like, so we were holding on to something so strong, and now that the world is starting to open up a bit, but also be more volatile, that's when a lot of the crises of faith happen. Not necessarily in the context of hardship, but the context after hardship has ended and you have actually time to grieve. And so you're stuck with this feeling of like, how do I even make sense of what happened? And sometimes you can't make sense of what happened, but there's a need to find a way to reconcile that meanings may be things you don't have access to right now. And so you have to actually reconcile that God knows the meaning and you do not know. And it's not an easy pill to swallow at all. So the stories of faith are so contingent and so dynamic that it goes beyond, oh, someone became much more pious and religious in prison, or someone lost faith. It's so circular. And because these people are still alive, you really can't, you can't make like a statement as to how it's going to end. Faith changes. Faith is a very, very dynamic thing.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask one small addition to this, which was, so the book, one way of reading the book, and this is not the only way of reading the book, but one way of reading the book is to see that that the transcendent in the book, right? The transcendent in the book is this connection to the divine that the prisoners use in order to resist, survive, to endure. And throughout the book, there is a kind of, let me put it this way, an anxiety with capture, right? An anxiety with captivity. This idea of being under the control of and under the restriction of another. And this other that we're talking about is a worldly entity, whether it's the prison guards, whether it's the state, the prison system. My question is it possible to, in light of the prisoners and their experience, is it possible to actually submit and be held captive to a transcendent while rejecting every form of submission and capture in the world? Is that something that we as Muslims should learn from the prisoners? That in order for us to be in submission to God, as the faith of the prisoners show us through the book, that we have to reject every kind of capture in the world? Is that something that we should take away from the faith of the prisoners? Or is it possible, or is submission something that is fluid between the transcendent and immanent, meaning that you have to allow to be captured in the world in order to be the kind of person that would also submit and be captured by God?
Jazakallah khair, I think. That's a tough question, man. Because I think, as Wallah's describing, right, faith is very, very dynamic. It's one of the reasons why يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا, right? قلوب, not قلبنا, right? على دينك, right? So the plural is used in the hadith, in the dua. Why? Because the heart is a constantly changing thing. It's not in one state. It shifts. Your iman is high, your iman is low, right? It's not a static position. Prisoners are a microcosm an extreme microcosm of everything that we deal with in daily life, right? You know, الدنيا سجن للمؤمن, right? So the prison, the world is a prison for the believer. So we know this hadith. What does that mean for us in our daily lives? It means that, you know, the dunya isn't something that should it's something that restricts us, right, in so many different ways. But ultimately, for what though? For what? For freedom in an afterlife. Okay, it flips everything upside down. In terms of incarceration, the brothers are imprisoned physically, but what they find is that they're free mentally in many cases. Those who engage in a dynamic way with their faith. And the stories are so different from one another. And we try to bring this out, like in the section that we write on theodicy, for example, Babar Ahmed, who was in prison for, I'm going to say 11 years in the UK before he was extradited to the US, where he was held in solitary confinement in the US. He says it very, very clearly that, you know, that faith was never a static thing for me. It was something that I had ups and downs, that if anybody told me otherwise, they're lying to themselves. But in the very next section, you have Ali al-Marri, who was held for like 13 years in solitary confinement in the US, at the Charleston Naval, telling you that I had complete certainty in Allah's qadr for me, like complete, because from the very moment it started. And Ali al-Marri was, subhanAllah, he's amazing, right? It took 6 months for his interrogators to finally arrive. And the whole point of 6 months complete solitary, there were only 3 prisoners in this prison, Charleston Naval Brick, only 3. And they had this massive industrial fan that was constantly on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to stop any sound escaping into or from the cell. So they were in complete isolation for 6 months. The interrogators finally turned up and thinking that this is going to be a broken man by this stage. And Ali al-Mahdi says to them, you denied me a Quran for 6 months, right? Now you give me the Quran for 6 months. After I've had the Quran for 6 months, you come back and you ask me the questions you want, but I'm not talking to you. They said, we're going to take another 6 months then. You either talk to us or there's nothing at all. He goes, if you make me wait another 6 months, I'm going to make you wait a year before I speak to you. He never spoke to them, never answered a single question that they asked him about his case. He spoke to them about football, about sports, about whatever. When they finally decided to start giving him the things that he demanded, this is a man who describes himself as having complete certainty in Allah's qadr from the absolute off. He was just like, you never imprisoned me. It was never you who imprisoned me. It's Allah's decision that I'm here right now. And that's it. I'm gonna make the most of my time. This is a man who used to, in the first 10 nights of Ramadan, finish the khatam of the Quran in Taraweeh every single night. The second 10, he finished it twice a night. And then the last 10, he would do almost 3 khatams of the Quran every single night. So you can tell something a little bit about this man and what he's a Qatari national, very, very incredible person. You know, actually, I remember interviewing him once many years ago, and we were talking about his experiences, and he started like, you know, getting a bit emotional. I said, you know, are you okay? You know, and he said, I was just thinking about my brother and the torture that my brother went through in Guantanamo Bay. So his brother Jarallah had been detained in Guantanamo Bay. And he said, and when I was thinking about his torture, I thought that maybe my iman is so weak that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided to give me the easier task of being in the US rather than being sent to Guantanamo. And you know, you're never supposed to get emotional when you're doing interviews with the brothers, but I got to say I got very emotional in that moment, because actually Ali al-Mahdi's situation was much harder. The brothers in Guantanamo had the ability to speak to one another outside. Well, yes, they went through immense torture, but solitary confinement, you cannot even begin to imagine what a single week of solitary confinement does to your state of mind. To keep yourself intact, it is a task that is beyond Herculean. And you know, this man, he did it for 13 years. And it was so designed that even because we had all these documents by Allah's qadr leaked out to the US, 27,000 pages of documents that, you know, we at Cage went through. And what they were doing in the interrogation logs, they were detailing, if he asks you any question, make sure you only respond with the word noted. Don't respond to him. Don't answer a single question. So even the guards, the brothers in Guantanamo not only gave talk to the guards, they gave dawah to the guards, and the guards accepted Islam, right? In Ali al-Mahdi's case, we're not permitted to talk to him at all. So it was complete isolation, not even like a pseudo form of isolation where the guards, at least you can maybe build a rapport with them. There are some good guards, there are some bad guards, there's some rapport that takes place. So I think the question itself about transcendence is a little bit complicated because it does depend on the individual, and there are individuals who have intense crises of faith. Well, I want you to tell the story about Surah Maryam from one of your interviews, because that's a really incredible one.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think it's a really, really good aqidah question. And there are different sort of like parts that we can sort of begin to unravel. I mean, in terms of like being controlled by something that is worldly, on the one hand, you can try as much as you can to be mentally free. And that is something that people try to, because it's human nature, right? But there is the undeniable reality that your body is controlled. Your body is controlled. You go to the toilet when they let you go to the toilet. You sleep when they let you go to sleep. You eat when they let you go to eat. You see your family. In the case of Egyptians, in the Guantanamo case, no one can see their families, but you get to make contact with your families when they let you. So there is the reality that a part of you is controlled, and that's something that is important to keep in mind, because it just highlights the tension of like trying to achieve and trying to realize your connection with God that goes beyond the prison, because your tangible reality is one of incarceration and captivity and control. And I think this is where, again, the Aqidah part gets quite interesting, in terms of like, can people have full submission to God if they did not know that God is good? In a way, one of the main questions that comes up is that God does not give someone a burden more than they can bear, right? But you're in a particular context and you don't even have control of what you think your capacity is, but God does. But you have to maintain the knowledge that God, even though there's nothing incumbent upon him, but God loves you and is good and wants good for you. And that's a part of like the challenge of submission, when you have a really, really violent reality and a knowledge that God can see and a knowledge that God has power. And that knowledge is like constantly sort of in flux and questioned and negotiated and revisited, et cetera, depending on the circumstance. But that is the question of submission. How do you know your own capacity to bear? Because at some points you feel like it's too much, but this is still happening to me. Why is God letting this happen to me? And actually, in some stories, I would hear that when someone dies in prison, the discourse around their death is it's a form of mercy, because God now knows that this is all they can bear. So God is releasing them off this particular burden. So it's the mercy of God that they're letting them go from this current situation they're in, because beyond that, they wouldn't be able to bear it. But in terms of like the question of like human capacity, it goes back to the Surah Yusuf that one of my interlocutors had mentioned, and Asim was discussing. Is this? So one of the people I interviewed was talking about how he was having these questions about free will. So if free will is something that exists, how am I in a context where I can't enact this free will? How is it that God has power, but he hasn't used his power to remove me out of this place. And then he was reading Surah Maryam, and he was concerned. He didn't want to talk to other people in prison about these questions of like why God is letting this happen, because he didn't want to be deemed as someone who wasn't steadfast in his faith. And it came to the ayah where God was telling Maryam to shake the palm tree in order to eat something. And he said it was as if God was telling her, it's okay. It's painful, but I got you, have a chocolate. It's okay to be hurt. And then there's the verse where she says, I wish I had been dead and uh, I was forgotten before this. And he said, if I had said something like that, people around me would have said, you lost faith completely. What are you on about? You're talking about death. But it's that mercy of God where he didn't condemn her for wanting an out, right? He told her, it's okay. You have to go through this. You have to go through this extreme pain, physical pain of childbirth, but also emotional pain of being ostracized by your whole community, and you won't be able to respond. But for now, take it easy, eat something, and I'll be with you. And he said, sometimes the prisoner, he realized, he's like, sometimes you just have to go through hardship for something more beautiful to come out. And you might not see it at this particular time. And this is a narrative, by the way, that's ongoing. I have to have gone through this, so this would happen, so that would happen, so I would meet this person, so I would be in this place in my life. If I hadn't gone through this initial thing, I wouldn't be where I am right now. And this is a beautiful, beautiful sort of introspective thing, but also it's important to note that's a hindsight comment. There's a whole period of years where you have no clue what's going on. All you know is that the promise that God is not going to give you more than your capacity, but you feel like you're at your capacity. And then when you realize that you actually were able to like live beyond what you thought your capacity is to be, you realize that you're not actually in control of yourself. You don't know your human capacity. God is in charge. You're not in charge. So it's extremely, extremely enlightening, honestly.
I want to allow the people who came to also participate by asking questions, and I don't want to just take up the whole time. And Sammy is here, so I want to think his comments are also going to be very insightful. I'll ask one more question. I have a ton of questions, but I'll ask one more question. And I was really taken aback by how much the sensorium, the human sensorium, played in the whole book. Like this negotiation over the body and what it feels and what it smells and what it views and what it hears and all this that's going on. And it was almost as though there was a back and forth battle, right, between what the prison guards and what the prison is trying to do with your body and what the prisoners are trying to do with their body. And I think the pinnacle and the climax of this is the chapter on torture, right? Whereby the body is used as a way to break you down, your own body. And I just wanted to talk to you about both the mechanisms within the prison by which the prison imagines itself kind of taking control of you through different methods, and then also how our bodies are these vehicles, right? For breaking us down, but also they're also sites of resistance. So I mean, that to me was a very, very powerful part of the book, and I just wanted you to comment on that. And then after that, I'm going to let others talk and also interact with you guys.
So the body is such an important site because it's a site that the prison thinks it can own. It's one of the reasons why in our section on torture, sexual humiliation features heavily. 75% of the chapter is about sexual humiliation. In fact, when Walaa and I were discussing it, I split my torture chapter into two parts: cultural humiliation and sexual humiliation. And Walaa said to me, well, I can't do that because all torture in Egypt is sexual humiliation. There is no such thing otherwise, which is why her section in that chapter is entirely one narrative. It tells you a lot about the way in which they think that they can own the body and the senses and everything about you. There's a really important moment that happens in Guantanamo Bay. This actually got revealed fairly early on. Eric Saar, who was an interrogator there, he wrote a book called Behind the Wire, where he describes the scene where Jumal Dosri, the Bahraini Guantanamo Bay detainee, he was being interrogated, and his female interrogator was basically trying to like sexually arouse him by touching him and doing all sorts of terrible things. And he effectively, spits in her face, and says, just go away from me. I don't want any of this. She leaves the room and goes to her Arabic speaking interpreter and says, how can I break this guy? He says to her, pretend like you're smearing menstrual blood on him and then turn off the taps to his cell so he's not able to wash himself. So this was their way of trying to control the body. When you look at, for example, Ali al-Mari, going back to him, the interrogation logs I was telling you about, where they're detailing everything that they're doing. There's a moment that comes in the interrogation logs that I had to then ask him about later because it was a story I hadn't heard. I said, I'm really sorry to ask you this, but it describes them watching you plucking your pubic hair. Again, I'm sorry to be graphic, but he was like, oh, okay, yeah, let me tell you the story about that. They weren't allowing me access to a razor, and I felt unclean. As Muslims were supposed to shave, and so I would pluck by hand in order to become pure, because that's what I wanted to do, right? So the whole, obviously, this is a very painful process for him to go through, but he is trying to maintain his autonomy throughout the whole period of time, and trying his absolute best to control himself in whatever way he can, and to show them as well that you do not own me completely. There are still things that I can do to own my body and myself.
Can you get the mic?
Sexual dystopia is used, I mean, even outside of the prison, on the non-carceral prison, how a sexual dystopia is created and maintained in order to, control our bodies. And it's probably like the most glaring feature of our society today. And the fact that it reflects so starkly in prison as a technique, like calculated. You speak about psychologists being employed. So it was a moment of deep reflection, right? Sexual shame and humiliation. I mean, what we're experiencing outside of prison, in many ways, highlighted how we're all experiencing a certain kind of sexual humiliation and shame through the dystopia that is maintained. Obviously, these things are kind of hard to compare because, I mean, what's happening in prison with torture is on a different level altogether, but it brings in relief, like how we're all dealing with this on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. SubhanAllah. I just wanted to share one other thing before I pass on to Walaa, which is Ali sent me a voice note recently after the book was finished. But like the things are still coming back to people. And he said to me, it's amazing that I was in solitary confinement for so long, and I just, and I forgot to share with you at the time. But there are certain conditions where your prayers are amplified, like going to the haram, for example. It's magnified many times over by praying there or praying in Jama'ah. But actually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also told us that when you're by yourself and you make the adhan and you make aqama and you become a Jama'ah on your own, then by 50 times your prayers, and he goes, that was us, that was me. Like my salah, if Allah accepts it, was magnified so many, and they never understood that. They never understood that I was benefiting by being in the sensory isolation, complete sensory isolation. But and that's why for me that the title of the book, which I think it was either Walaa or her husband came up with in the end, really speaks so perfectly, because these guys are literally on their own, but they have this fundamental understanding that Allah can still see me in this moment. You try to shut off everything, every wall, every door, every window, every single thing you try to do. But I know that Allah is still seeing me in this moment. And that we really can't, kind of countenance how amazing that actually is.
Yeah. Credit to Amr. I think so there are so many elements that are so terrifying about all of this. The one thing that's glaringly terrifying for me is how these technologies travel, how the control and aspects of humiliation is a whole history in of itself. It moves from like Nazi Germany to East Germany to Syria to Egypt to Iraq to Guantanamo to the UK. Like there is an element of like, and the thing is, I don't want to overemphasize their discipline, because yeah, in some instances these are manuals. In other instances, the torturers are just torturers who are doing and creating techniques and are high on personal sense of power. So sometimes it's a disciplined top down, like this is how you break a person, and sometimes the individual is so evil within themselves that they take ways in trying to break a human being. Like when you give that much power to someone that has a sense of like God complex, it can really create horrific things. So the way that torture techniques travel and the way that sexual humiliation travels has to tell you something about how states view their population and the bodies of their population as something in need of not just disciplining, but also molding and breaking into their own to their own liking. And I think hunger strikes are a really, really interesting point where that debate plays out, because on the one hand, the state is trying to break your body, trying to kill your body, or put it to the point of almost death, but not quite death, so they don't have to share a culpability. And then hunger strikes becomes a sort of way of reclaiming the body, of like slowly sort of destroying it in a way, sort of slowly letting it wither in a way to amplify it, to make it this conduit of resistance. And so like when I talk to different mashayikh and their understandings of like how the body becomes a conduit of resistance, is really, really interesting. Because on the one hand, the state wants to kill you. The chaplain says, this is haram, you can't do it. But then if you don't listen to them, they send you to the doctor. If you don't listen to them, they send you to the torturer and you're put in solitary confinement. And I think that happened with multiple people, I think, including Professor Sami. So yeah, and then it becomes a place where you do have control over yourself for a little bit, but there's also the real reality that a part of you will be broken, like whether it's through hunger strikes or torture. Like these things last and they have impact like 10, 12, 20 years after you're outside of the prison context. The torture, the sexual humiliation and violation does impact the way a person interacts or views their body. And so like this is not something that we talked about in the book, but instances where people like become increasingly promiscuous after like rape happens in prison or whatever. How do we conceive this or understand this and reconcile this in terms of our theology and like what's halal and haram versus the actual reality of what happened, and maybe our own culpability in allowing this to happen? When I was interviewing Sheikh Dadu about hunger strikes, and he was of the opinion that, if you are certain that this is going to lead to death, then try to find something else. Don't go on hunger strike up until you reach your death. And I asked him, well, what if you think you're not going to die, but it just so happens that you end up dying? So what will that mean for your afterlife? Because some people would say, this will be a form of suicide and, you'll get punished as a result. And he said the culpability are on those that didn't save him. And I think it's a really scary question, especially now when we're talking about like Gaza and boycotts and all of the systems that we're invested in and our universities and all that. Where do we draw the lines of our own culpability with all of this? It's really uncomfortable and it's a really scary question because the security apparatuses are so intertwined with like capitalism, within education, within everything, that we all play a role. So where do we draw the line? I think that's something we need to think about, but it's a terrifying question, to be honest.
Okay, so I want to open up. I'll save Dr. Samia, your comments. Would you like to make them now or towards the end? I'd like to finish with your comments, and so let me open the floor. Let me open the floor to the participants. One last observation before I do that is, I want to mention the Ummah before I hand over the mic. I felt like it was one exception to worldly capture that I saw in the prison narratives was the imaginative act of putting yourself in a community which which was very different than all the other acts of resistance, which were kind of like, I want to give myself or enhance my relationship with God as a form of resistance. And so there was a kind of the community, the Ummah played a very empowering role, which was different than these individual acts of resistance in terms of the relationship with God. And I just want to note that, and maybe we can discuss it further with the participants here. So any questions from the audience and the participants here in the room? Yeah, I really think that. Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead. You gotta speak close. It's very.
Actually, I think all of us feel that we don't really have so many questions. This has been very moving for all of us. But I just want to say that the situation of the state or the position of authority or authoritarianism, it didn't just start recently. I think it has started from Karbala and it is still continuing. And as Muslims, we have allowed these things to happen in front of us, like the visible, which we seem to make invisible. And I do feel that religious interpretations and religious scholarship has played a part in this situation in authenticating or validating the state authority in our minds, in the minds of the masses. I mean, this is just an observation, and of course, I feel myself guilty of it too. And I would like to understand, of course, I haven't read the book. If there have been stories of the families of the detainees as well, because I can understand that being inside prison is one thing, but I think the families would have been prisoners of maybe society, how people may have looked upon them, how their relationships might have changed. So that is something which I would like to know if it's possible. Thank you.
Are we going to take a few questions or are we going to respond?
Yeah, I think we can go ahead with that question first. Just from my side, I mean, there have been certain, books that have been written about experiences of families. Victoria Britton's The Forgotten Women of the War on Terror, for example, is one such book. I've tried to write about the experiences of families myself, but it is a highly understudied topic because we generally tend to focus on the experience of the prisoner. But actually, Walaa and I end the book, the last paragraph is a call to remind us that not that imprisonment is the easiest part, but if you speak to any released prisoner, they say to you that the hardest part of our life, especially in terms of their iman, was freedom. They will, to a person, I've never come across a released prisoner who said that my iman was higher outside of prison, after prison, than it was inside prison. Not a single one. And I've been doing this work for over 20 years now. Without, to a person, they will tell you, my iman was at its highest, my ibadah was at its highest, my relationship to the Quran, my relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my love of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all of these things were at their peak in prison, and at release, the dunya comes rushing at you in a way that you never imagined. You have to start worrying about the family you left behind, a relationship with your kids that you never had or you were denied, sometimes 15 years. You have to start worrying about a job. Like maybe you had a profession before you went inside, or you could have been a child when you went inside, like, some of the people that we write about in the books. And you come out and you missed all the years where you would have had a high school diploma, or you would have gone to university and you would have had an education and you would had already started your working life. So this book, inshallah, hopefully it will encourage others in the field to write more about what happens afterwards. But more importantly, it should be a rallying call to say that what happens afterwards is not the end of detention. The detention experience carries not only for the individual, but for the families a long time after the detention ends. And if we do not change our mentality to understand that and recognize that, we will always fail these brothers and sisters. We will continually fail them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I see your question having sort of three sides. The first is about religious memory and how we view despotism and injustice in our own like religious heritage. And it's something that's really, really interesting because on the one hand, we can perceive it as something that is inherently like forgotten by the wider Muslim community, but these stories continue to give meaning to oppressed people everywhere. These are the stories where people conjure up and remember, this is the grandson of the Prophet, this happened to him, what about me? So these stories, even though they depict something about the wider Muslim community, but in particular moments of crises, they bring a lot of meaning and a lot of solace to people who are struggling. In terms of religious authority, it's something that we've discussed quite a bit, but I think I'd like to bring it back to the question of our culpability as like normal Muslims living and accepting the invisibility of these spaces, where we can sort of compartmentalize a religious discourse from the imperatives of justice. And in a way, like a book like this can be a feel-good book that can sort of like, oh, people went through such hardship. Oh, subhanallah, we didn't go through it. Iman is so amazing. Maybe we should have our Iman too. But that's a reading I'd really advise against. I think it should move us to think about our own culpability in like structures of violence that produce these places, and knowing that they're all around us and we're all contributing to it, and we're all potentially victims of it. But even if we're not victims of it, it victimizes our people and other people that are not necessarily our people too. So if you don't take like religion in a holistic way, it can lead you to a kind of like consumption politics of Islam, and that is inherently problematic. in terms of the families of prisoners, yeah, like Asim said, it's an important topic and it's something that requires an incredible amount of studies because there's so much divergence, but also like there's so much that can be brought out. I know that there is this one PhD student, Rahma Fatin, who's working on this topic. So I'm really looking forward to, in the context of Egypt. So I'm really looking forward to sort of reading what she has to say.
I will now, Dr. Sami, if you could give your comments. I saw you scribbling very profusely on the sheet of paper, so I'm sure you have some very important things to say. Sure, sure.
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, closer like that. Speaking up to the phone. I've been listening to the interesting meeting, and I'm so happy to attend this and the book and to read the book. And I want to back some of the stories that Brother Asim has said. And I was in Guantanamo myself for about five years. And we were, for example, they spoke about control and how the people in Guantanamo were very important. Control for them was very important. Is that people inside prison were not allowed to learn any language. They're prevented from learning even English or any other language. I started to learn, for example, German, Russian, and Spanish. And every time you start, and then because what happens that when they put some prisoner next to you in another cell, you start to learn from him. So if he knows he's a German, then you start learning German. So as soon as you start learning German from him, they'll move you to another cell very far away. So especially if they see that you have learned some substantial points of language. Same with Spanish, with Russian, and so on. And then there was one time with this interrogator. Her name was Leslie from the FBI. And I said to her, why do you keep moving me away from each time I start a language? And I start just picking up the language, then you move me away to another cell, very far away cell, to someone else. She said, look, there's a policy in Guantanamo that you don't learn anything from him. And I know this policy is rubbish, says, but this is how they think. This is one story. Another story from another interrogator. He said, like, we had different problems, and then I came to this different. We had like I've been there for about 5 years. We had not hundreds, but tens of interrogators, different interrogators. So there's many of them. Most of them were bad and evil, but some of them were more reasonable than others. So this man, I asked him. I said, why do you do this? Why do you do this policy? You keep, for example, doing this thing in the Quran or doing something stupid. Why do you try to not normalize prison? There's a policy where it's important that people are not peaceful inside prison. There's always a problem of some sort that is being created, not real problem, but they intend to create problems so to disturb and destabilize the prisoners, they think. And this, they say, helps them to get prisoners to talk and so on. So I said, this is my view, but I asked him, why do you do this? Why these problems are you make up problems? Like some people been there for years. And if they were in Arab prisons, for example, we know that torture starts in the beginning, and then after that, we just leave you to live your life inside these cells. But in the American prisons, more sophisticated and worse than any other Arab country or any backward country. Why? Because even their torture is so much sophisticated. It continues throughout your imprisonment. If you're imprisoned like my friend here for 9 years, then you'll be tortured for 9 years. So when I asked him, so he says, look, because you mentioned control. He said it's control. It's control. It's just nothing else. It's just we have to show that we are in control of this prison. This is another story. Another story backing Asim's speaking. They spoke about different dreams inside prisons and things like that. Of course, dreams, they come so much to people because you're in need of help, in need of comfort and hope and so on. And one of the dreams that, for example, I had, which I think is interesting, is like when at the beginning of imprisonment, things became so difficult and hard. Usually in the beginning, it's more harder than middle or at the end. So I asked, in my prayers, I asked, what will happen? What will happen to us? How will be, when this imprisonment will end? I asked Allah in my du'as to understand and show me something in my dreams. So I saw a long dream where I saw like a film which everything that happened to us in Guantanamo came to me in a dream. It was very fast and very vivid. So I woke up and I asked Allah in another night, I said, I want to know how long I'm going to stay in this prison. Allah, please help me, tell me how many years I'm going to stay in this prison. Allah. And he said, and then in the next time I slept, the next night, I think, a voice came to me and he said, from 4 to 5. From 4 to 5. I didn't understand. Then I woke up and I was thinking about it. I said, 4 to 5. It must be 4 or 5 days. I'm going to be released after 4 or 5 days. And then I started counting 4 or 5 days. 4 or 5 days passed and nothing happened. So I realized it's not 4 or 5 days. I said, okay, it's good. 4 or 5 months, no problem. I could be patient for 4 or 5 months, then I'll be released. Then 4 or 5 months passed and I was so saddened because I understand it's going to be maybe 4 or 5 years. And yes, this is what happened. I was after 5 years, I was released. Yeah. Another story is like when we were in prison, somebody came and we in my dreams we had somebody came with the keys. I know his name is Abu Zubaydah, and he came and locked the cells from outside. And then afterwards, I had the keys in my pockets, and in this dream that these keys were in my pocket, and I was in the same cell. I was in Guantanamo, then I was in Pakistan. But even before I was in Guantanamo, I saw the cells in Guantanamo, and I had the keys in my pocket. And I know Abu Zubaydah, because under his torture, he said something that caused me to be in Guantanamo. So I saw that in this dream that I had the keys in my pocket, and I was sitting down inside these cells, and I'm not opening because I was so lazy to get up and open the cells. And every time throughout those 5 years inside Guantanamo, I was thinking, what is the explanation of this dream? What is these keys? And I have these keys in my pocket, and I know Abu Zubaydah must have said something, and this is locked. Because after that, second night, we were taken to Bagram and taken to Guantanamo. So I didn't understand until I came one day after 5 years. I came next to a friend of mine called Muhammad al-Shayba. It's a Saudi, he was next to me in prison. And I told him the dream. I said, I saw this dream that says, in my pocket, I had the keys, and I'm sitting down and not trying to open the keys. And I know in the dream, it says, like, whenever I want to get up and open the door, it's possible for me to open the doors. So he said, it's obvious, very obvious. The keys are the dua. You're not doing dua, you're being lazy, not doing enough du'as to be released from this prison. And I said, SubhanAllah, yeah, this must be it. This must be the explanation. The explanation came after 5 years. So I started to make du'as, and yes, after that I was released from prison. So just an example of dreams, I think. And then when you mentioned the imprisonment of our bodies and the souls are always trying to go out from the cells. We had usually I don't have dreams like in my when my sleeping, even now in normal life. I don't have much nice dreams like these. That in Guantanamo, one night, I was so, for example, exhausted and saddened and so on. So I wish that my soul would go somewhere else out from all these cells. Because it's like 5 years continuously inside the same doors, the same locks. So I saw in my dream that night, I saw that I was like traveling in the sky, very high in the sky, and then coming down to Gaza, Gaza, Quds, where the Masjid al-Aqsa, and then like coming down, and then seeing all the masjid and everything in detail. I never seen before in my life. I never seen it in films, nothing. And then even after that, came down and then I saw the masjid, the mosque was being, like somebody coming flying from above and then coming down to inside the masjid. They're slowly going inside the masjid. Then I saw the walls and I saw the doors and I saw the structure. It was like you've really been there. It's really helpful. When I woke up, I was really like refreshed. It's so as if I visited the mosque. And the shocking part is when I saw the pictures of the masjid inside, Masjid Al-Aqsa, and the details of the Masjid Al-Aqsa were exactly the same as I saw in the dream. And it's not something that happens to me usually. I never see normally dreams like this. An example of, you mentioned dreams and how the spirit is locked up in those prisons and so on. So, just wanted to back up the things that you've been saying about imprisonment and the things you mentioned in your talks, which, I thank you very much. I hope this is a learning experience for all of us. And thank you very much for.
Thank you so much for sharing.
I want to first thank Dr. Asim and Dr. Walaa for writing the book. So congratulations and thank you for writing it. Certainly, it gives inspiration, particularly for those who have seen the walls of the prison. You just brought so many memories that I was going through as you were speaking. Sometimes these memories are suppressed, you're not thinking about it. But when you start reading the book or hearing people, then all these memories come together. Perhaps one of the most important things for political prisoners, as you have mentioned, is this concept of resistance. That you are there because of whatever things you have upset the authorities to be, and they're trying to not only control you, but also to break you down. So I remember when we were first taken, this was a very high profile case, perhaps the most high profile case at the time, in which we were taken and 4 of us, and we were put behind, not just in solitary confinement, but it was a cell within a cell within a cell with armed guards, just to make it like these are very dangerous guys. But in about a week, of course, this was very costly. So they moved us to 4 separate cells, 2 in the bottom, 2 on up. So we can talk to each other, but we can't see each other. And Jum'ah came and we start thinking, what are we going to do about Jum'ah today? So we decided, no, we're going to have Jum'ah. So, somebody made the adhan, I made the khutbah, and we started. And of course, I decided that I would be on a hunger strike to make a political statement. And I had to go through this 3 times during. But the idea of, inventing or improvising fiqh as you go along, because you do that all the time. And particularly when you are being transferred from place to place, and we wouldn't allow it to make wudu, or then you have to make tayammum, but there is no fact to be tayammum with. So what do you do? And these kind of things, or sometimes you're going through snow, and it is fajr, and they leave you in the snow. So what do you do? So you have to use the snow. Basically, it is a place of, and you're totally shackled. At any rate, so these are the type of things you come to learn. But also in terms of defiance, I remember I was once on a hunger strike, and they kept sending me from prison to prison. And one of the prisons was so local, so county kind of prison, and they had never seen hunger strike, never dealt with a hunger strike before. So when they were asking me if I have any restrictions on my food, I said, I am on hunger strike. And said, what does that mean, hunger strike? So I explained to them hunger strike. And this has nothing to do with you. It's between me and the federal government. So you don't have to worry about it. But once they told the authorities, they came to my cell. They took all my clothes, took my glasses, which I can't see without, and they gave me something called turtle suit. It's something that basically like sleeping bag stuff, and it only covers basically from above your knees and to your shoulders, so you can't even pray. So it was very disturbing. I had nothing in my room. So what do you do about that? And no one knows actually where you are. So I kept banging on the door until a prisoner who was cleaning turned out to be a Muslim. So I explained to him, I said, here is the the press release, I wanted to call my son and give him that press release. So he did that, and I didn't know what they did with it, but actually they released it throughout, and then the prison was basically the phone system was shut down. So the next day, I get the head of the prison and all the administrators, all 4 or 5 of them, said, "Who are you? What are you doing there? Why are you shutting down our prison system?" Tell them I'm not going to speak to you until first give me my glasses. I can't even see you. And then they got my glasses. I said, "Give me my clothes, and then we'll speak." So for the absolutely. So the question of solidarity, the question, it makes a huge difference of how you resist and how you can go about it and make a case for it. Another story, of course, this happened also when I was also on a hunger strike. This was in Ramadan also. This was in I believe it was September 2006. Actually, no, sorry, this was not a hunger strike. No, this was just Ramadan. Sorry, that hunger strike was another story, but this one was just Ramadan. But we were going to another prison, but this one by an airplane. So when we got to Oklahoma is just an airport with a prison in it. That's where they take everybody, and there is no solitary confinement in that place except for me. So just I wanted to imagine the following: that you are, say maybe like Ali al-Mirri. So they put you in solitary confinement during Ramadan for 3 straight days with nothing except in a room of the size of a bathroom. And you stay there for 3 days, see nobody, talk to nobody, read nothing. You can't know even the day, the time of the day, because there's no windows. And the only thing you can guess is just your own guess. And they open the slot where they showed you, they throw the food at you during suhoor and futur. So this is the type also, and so why are they doing this? Well, they don't never explain to you, but it's a type of how you break it down. So when you go through all these things, and of course many other stories that people go through, you certainly, the level of faith and connection, spiritual connection, is something that it's very difficult to describe. And I'm sure anybody who's gone through this, they probably give you different stories. During my trial, you reach a state, and of course, some of these dreams are related in the book. So if you read it, you can probably get some of them. But the question is the level, because you don't know what's going to happen. Certainly, you have to accept what Allah is written for you. But at the same time, you have this, of course, hope and faith, but you also have to consider, that worst thing could happen, and it's a matter of test, whether you pass the test or not. But your connection is very important. So always people tell me what would sustain people in that situation, and I'd say it's really faith and then the families. So the question of families resonates with me pretty much. And I know there are some broken families who went through this experience. They were not prepared for it. But also family is a huge source of support for people. So I always tell people, if you think you're ever going to get through such experience, make sure you have good, strong family bond. That's what sustains people in addition to faith. There are so many stories when people go through this, knowing that this is you're in prison because of what you represent, what your positions are, what you've advocated. You're not there just because somebody wronged you, but because, when they say you have the key to your prison, what they mean by that, if you betray your principles, if you betray what you believed in, if you betray your, because I can say, for example, that I was the target, but with me were 3 other individuals. They were just the victims of being close to me. And each one of them was offered basically whatever they wanted. One of them actually died 2 years ago, and we were together for many years. And in his case, he was exactly 2 weeks away from defending his PhD dissertation. something that he was working on for 5 years, 2 weeks from defending it and moving back to the West Bank. He was arrested and was never given a chance, but he was offered. He was offered to finish his PhD, to be given U.S. citizenship, to stay, um, job, money, whatever you wanted. And he said, I will never lie or betray my principles. The other two individuals were offered the same, but they would never betray their principles. So this is being political prisoner is a huge burden. And sometimes we look at some of the things we go through out in life and we think that the sky is falling on us. But there are people who actually today I am fortunate. I feel that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed, at least how it ended. But there are a lot of people who have been suffering for years, and they are as innocent and as brave and courageous and faithful and steadfast as everybody. And they are all over the world, including, of course, in the United States. As the brother said, the United States is a very sophisticated society in terms of how they handle prisoners. And I believe firmly that modern day prisons, particularly in the West, but all over, is modern day slavery. There is a documentary, it's called 13th. If you ever get to see it, talks about the 13th Amendment. 13th. Yeah, 13th Amendment, which talks about slavery. But that's what it is today. It's modern day slavery, and they try to control every aspect of your life. I remember that a sense of triumph, we were prevented having tea or hot water to make tea. And of course, I wasn't allowed to buy tea bags. I wasn't allowed to have hot water. So I would take perhaps sometimes 3 or 4 hours in a struggle to convince one of the inmates who would be cleaning to get me hot water. And of course, you have to pay him. But once, if he can get away from the guards and go to microwave and get possibly a bag of something and put the hot water, and then he has to get it to me, in which I have to take the cover of a book or a notebook, put it between the doors, and then he has to pour it from one side. I have to catch it from the other side, and then I have to convince somebody to send me a tea bag. So this process could take 4 or 5 hours, but at the end, when you are successful, that's trained. You defied the rules, and you were able to defeat the rules, and you're able to do it. So this kind of dynamics takes place. The thing is how you defy the rules, and of course, in the Gitmo context, probably will be even harder because you have more guards than you have prisoners. So let me just conclude by saying this is an important book. I'm glad it was written. I'm glad it will be available to people. You inspired me now to write my own, to have all these stories, because certainly it does make a difference in terms of how people see the things. And certainly many people do not know what's going on, as Walaa mentioned, what it means to be inside of a prison, what it means to be in solitary confinement. It's a form of torture, basically. It's an absolute torture. It's mental torture. And they use that knowing that it is torture. And I think most of the experts, particularly who deal with mental issues, they would tell you it is a form of torture. You put someone in solitary confinement as such. And therefore, part of the struggle, unfortunately, we in the across the Muslim world, we have learned these tactics from them. I know that there are some societies where this is not allowed, but even we made it even worse, because even in the United States, I feel that even though they do all these things, I still know that I have certain rights and I can fight. But people in the Muslim world, they can't fight, unfortunately, because there are zero rights afforded to them. We've seen what happens in many societies, including Egypt, where people could simply be tortured, Gaddafi prisons, Syria, others, and they could be losing their lives, and no one actually remembers them. It is one of the things that we have to fight for, and get organizations that can actually inform people that they cannot accept what happens to our brothers and sisters. And of course, we haven't even mentioned Palestine, but everybody knows also that this is part of what happened on October 7th. Is the thought that we had 5,500 people who have been basically in very, very difficult situations became even much worse once Ben Gvir was in charge of prisons. Some of them have been there for as long as 47 years. There are hundreds of them are there for lives. All the things that they have fought for dozens of years have been taken away from them. They call privileges, but this is what they got. And they kept, saying, do something for us. And what happened in October 7th was partly to get them released. But, you could see how evil also works in different ways. Again, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for coming to us and presenting. Is this your first time presenting about the book? Are we the first people?
This is the launch.
Oh my God. Okay. So we have been privileged then that you chose us to become the venue for this. So thank you very much, Walaa, and thank you, Asim.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, Dr. Walaa Quisay and Dr. Asim Qureshi. You both are always welcome here at SIGA and IZU, and we are very honored to have you both. And hopefully, Walaa, you'll be here in person and we'll be able to discuss as we did before. And for all the participants that came today, thank you for your participation. And I look forward to sharing with you our future programming